Welcome back, traveler. The fire burns once more, and the whispers of the planet call us to return. Last we spoke, the tale of Vincent Valentine had only begun to unfold, the man who walks between humanity and monstrosity, whose path is bound by guilt, memory, and shadow. Now we journey deeper into his legend to uncover what lies beyond the coffin's silence. And you, traveler, inscribe your mark in the journal. Tell us from which land you hail, and how many years had passed when you first heard the tale of Vincent. For your story, too, is part of the great memory. If you would keep these stories alive, return often and bring others to the fire, so that more may hear the legends yet to come. Now, let us walk back through the ages and continue the tale long left unfinished. That Vincent made his final, fatal decision. He could no longer stand by passively while horrors were perpetrated in the name of progress. He could no longer tell himself that his reduced role was sufficient penance for his inability to prevent what was happening to Lucrecia and her child. If he was going to act, it had to be now, before the birth, before the experiments moved into their next phase. His plan was desperate, born of months of frustration and growing certainty that he had failed in every way that mattered. He would confront Hojo directly, not with words or appeals to conscience, but with the tools of his trade. Vincent Valentine, Turk operative and expert marksman, would end the Genova project the only way he knew how, with violence, swift and final. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until the facility was operating with minimal staff during the late evening hours. Hojo was in his private laboratory working on calculations that would determine the timing and dosage of the next round of experimental treatments. Vincent approached through corridors he knew by heart, his footsteps silent on floors he had walked countless times during his months of exile. The laboratory door was locked, but Vincent's security access, though reduced, still granted him entry to most areas of the facility. He entered quietly, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, prepared to do what duty and conscience demanded. Hojo was bent over a workstation, his thin frame silhouetted against banks of monitors that cast eerie shadows across the room. He looked up as Vincent approached, showing no surprise at the intrusion, no fear at the obvious threat implied by Vincent's presence. "Mr. Valentine," the scientist said in his characteristic flat tone. "How unexpected. Have you come to discuss your concerns about our research methods once again?" "I've come to end this," Vincent replied, drawing his weapon with practiced smoothness. "The experiments stop now, Hojo. Tonight." Hojo's pale eyes studied the gun as if it were merely another piece of laboratory equipment. How fascinating. "You're prepared to commit murder to prevent what you perceive as a greater evil. The ethical calculations involved must be quite complex." "There's nothing complex about it," Vincent said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're torturing an innocent woman and her unborn child in service of your sick fantasies. That ends now." "Does it?" Hojo tilted his head slightly, and Vincent caught a glimpse of something predatory in that gesture. "Tell me, Mr. Valentine, have you considered all the variables in your equation? Have you accounted for every factor that might influence the outcome of your heroic intervention?" Something in Hojo's tone made Vincent hesitate, a note of confidence that suggested the scientist knew something Vincent did not. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Dr. Crescent's complete and willing participation in our research," Hojo replied smoothly. "I'm talking about consent freely given, choices made with full knowledge of the risks and potential benefits. You're not saving her from anything, Mr. Valentine. You're simply imposing your own moral framework on a situation you don't fully understand. She's been manipulated. She's been informed." Hojo interrupted. Every step of the process has been explained to her in detail. Every risk has been quantified and discussed. She has chosen to proceed because she believes, as I do, that the potential benefits far outweigh the temporary discomforts. Vincent felt doubt creeping into his certainty, but he forced it aside. Even if that's true, the child has no choice in the matter. You're condemning an innocent life to serve your ambitions. I'm offering that life possibilities beyond ordinary human limitations, Hojo countered. Strength, resilience, capabilities that normal humans can only dream of. In what way is that condemnation? The philosophical debate might have continued, but it was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Both men turned as the laboratory door opened and Lucrecia entered, her pregnancy now obvious in the curve of her figure. She moved with the careful grace of expectant motherhood, but her eyes held the same scientific fervor that had driven her to agree to Hojo's experiments. "Vincent," she said, taking in the scene with quick intelligence. "Put the gun down, please." "Lucrecia, you don't understand what he's doing to you, to your child." "I understand perfectly," she replied, moving to stand beside Hojo with a gesture that felt like a physical blow. "This is my choice, Vincent. My decision, made with full knowledge of what it means. You have no right to interfere." Vincent stared at her, seeing not the woman he had loved but something else, a zealot, a fanatic, someone who had sacrificed everything human about herself in service of scientific progress. The gun in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, weighted not just with metal and mechanisms but with the crushing realization that he had already lost everything that mattered to him. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice carrying the hollowness of final defeat. "Both of you. This will end in tragedy." "Perhaps," Hojo acknowledged with clinical detachment, "but that's a risk we're prepared to accept. The question is whether you're prepared to live with the consequences of your own choices." Vincent lowered the gun, but did not holster it. Something in Hojo's tone suggested that this confrontation was far from over, that the scientist had been anticipating this moment and had prepared for it accordingly. "What consequences?" "The consequence of interfering with a project sanctioned at the highest levels of corporate authority," Hojo replied. "The consequence of threatening key personnel involved in research that could revolutionize human potential. The consequence of allowing personal feelings to override professional duty." As Hojo spoke, Vincent became aware of movement in the shadows at the edge of the laboratory. Security personnel were taking positions around the room, their weapons trained on him with professional precision. He had walked into a trap, and the woman he loved had been part of the bait. "I'm sorry, Vincent," Lucrecia said, and he thought he heard genuine regret in her voice. "But I couldn't let you destroy what we're trying to accomplish here. The future depends on it." Vincent raised his weapon again, but not toward Hojo. If he was going to die in this place, surrounded by the machinery of ambition and the corpse of love, then he would at least deny them the satisfaction of taking him alive. The gun turned toward his own temple, a final gesture of defiance against circumstances he could not control and choices he could not accept. But Hojo was faster than Vincent had anticipated. The scientist's hand moved with startling quickness, activating controls that Vincent had not noticed in the shadows of the laboratory. A sharp pain lanced through Vincent's body, starting at his spine and radiating outward like electricity through water. He convulsed, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as his muscles betrayed him completely. "Fascinating," Hojo murmured, watching Vincent collapse to the laboratory floor with the detached interest of a researcher observing an unexpected development. "The neural disruptor works more efficiently than I calculated." "Mr. Valentine, You've just provided valuable data for our secondary research protocols. Vincent tried to speak, to move, to do anything other than lie helpless on the cold laboratory floor, but his body no longer responded to his will. He could see Lucrecia's face above him, her expression a mixture of scientific curiosity and something that might have been remorse. Her lips were moving, but the words seemed to come from a great distance, filtered through layers of gathering darkness. "What did you do to him?" Lucrecia asked, her voice sharp with concern that cut through Vincent's fading consciousness like a blade. "I sedated him, naturally," Hojo replied with clinical precision. "Though I must admit, the dosage was somewhat higher than strictly necessary. Mr. Valentine has proven to be remarkably resistant to conventional methods of persuasion. Perhaps a more direct approach will yield better results." The last thing Vincent remembered from that night was Lucrecia's face leaning over him, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or regret or simply scientific fascination at witnessing an unexpected experimental outcome. Her hand touched his cheek with a tenderness that reminded him for one brief moment of what they had once meant to each other. Then darkness claimed him completely, and Vincent Valentine began his long journey into nightmare. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, flashes of awareness separated by vast gulfs of medicated oblivion. Vincent found himself in a place that existed somewhere between laboratory and torture chamber, surrounded by equipment that hummed and clicked with malevolent purpose. His body was restrained, immobilized by mechanisms that held him as precisely as a specimen prepared for dissection. But dissection, as he gradually came to understand, was not Hojo's intention. The scientist had conceived something far more elaborate, far more cruel. "Ah, you're awake." Hojo's voice came from somewhere beyond Vincent's limited field of vision. "Excellent. Consciousness is necessary for the next phase of our research. I need you to be aware of what's happening, Mr. Valentine. Your subjective experience is crucial data for our understanding of the process." Vincent tried to speak, but found his vocal cords unresponsive. Hojo had anticipated every aspect of his captivity, ensuring that he could observe and experience but not communicate or resist. It was a scientist's idea of perfect experimental conditions, a conscious subject who could provide no variables except those specifically intended by the researcher. "You're probably wondering what I intend to do with you," Hojo continued, his voice carrying the same flat detachment he might have used to describe a weather pattern or chemical reaction. "The truth is, Mr. Valentine, you've provided me with an unexpected opportunity. Your interference in our primary research has created a need for additional data, particularly regarding the integration of foreign biological material with adult human subjects." The full horror of Hojo's intention gradually became clear as Vincent's drug-clouded consciousness sharpened. The scientist intended to use him as a test subject for the same Genova cells that were being administered to Lucrecia's unborn child. But where the fetal exposure was carefully controlled and monitored, Vincent's treatment would be experimental in the truest sense, a leap into unknown territory with no safety protocols and no concern for the subject's survival. Dr. Crescent has provided fascinating insights into the cellular adaptation process, Hojo continued, apparently finding Vincent's helpless presence conducive to scientific monologue. But her data is limited by the constraints of pregnancy and our concern for the developing specimen. You, however, present no such limitations. We can push the boundaries of biological integration much further, explore possibilities that would be too dangerous to attempt with our primary subject. Over the following days, though time became meaningless in that underground laboratory where artificial lights never dimmed and the machinery never slept, Vincent endured procedures that redefined his understanding of pain and transformation. Hojo injected him with Genova cells that invaded his system like a living virus, rewriting his genetic code with alien instructions that his body struggled to interpret and implement. The changes began subtly, heightened senses that made every sound a cacophony, every touch a burning sensation. Vincent could hear conversations taking place floors above him, could smell the fear and excitement of the research staff as they monitored his transformation. His vision sharpened until he could see individual dust motes floating in the air, could discern the microscopic details of the laboratory equipment that surrounded him. But these enhanced capabilities came at a terrible cost. Vincent's body was changing in ways that violated every natural law he had understood about human biology. His cellular structure was being rewritten by alien instructions that cared nothing for human limitations or human suffering. He could feel his bones lengthening and hardening, his muscles gaining density and power that no natural human could possess. The psychological changes were even worse than the physical transformation. Vincent found his thoughts invaded by alien memories, fragments of experiences that belonged to no earthly creature, visions of worlds that had never known the warmth of a sun like the one that lit the skies above Nibelheim. The Genova cells carried with them echoes of their origin, glimpses of a cosmic perspective that reduced human concerns to microscopic insignificance. Through it all, Hojo observed and recorded, his pale eyes bright with scientific fervor as he documented every stage of Vincent's metamorphosis. The scientist had found the perfect subject for his research, someone whose transformation could be pushed to its absolute limits without concern for consent or survival. Vincent had become the ultimate laboratory specimen, a living demonstration of what Genova integration could accomplish when freed from ethical constraints. "Remarkable," Hojo murmured during one of Vincent's brief periods of clear consciousness. "Your adaptation rate exceeds all projections. The Genova cells are not merely integrating with your biological systems, they're enhancing them, creating capabilities that transcend baseline human parameters. You're becoming something entirely new, Mr. Valentine, something superior." Vincent wanted to scream, to rage against the violation of his body and mind, but his voice had been stripped away along with his autonomy. He could only endure as the alien cells continued their invasion, rewriting him cell by cell into something that was no longer entirely human. His consciousness remained trapped within a form that grew more monstrous with each passing day, a prisoner of flesh that no longer entirely belonged to him. It was during the deepest phase of his transformation that Vincent experienced the most profound horror of Hojo's experiment. The Genova cells, having thoroughly invaded his biological systems, began to manifest their true nature. They were not merely enhancement material. They were fragments of a cosmic parasite that had once attempted to devour an entire world. And now those fragments were attempting to do the same to Vincent's consciousness, to subsume his identity into something alien and malevolent. Vincent found himself fighting a battle that took place on a level deeper than flesh and bone. His very sense of self was under assault by an intelligence that viewed him as nothing more than a useful host for its continued existence. The struggle was not one that could be won through physical strength or tactical superiority. It required an act of will that drew upon everything Vincent had ever been, everything he had ever believed about duty and love and the value of human choice. In the end, it was the memory of Lucrecia that saved him, not the zealous scientist who had chosen progress over love, but the woman he had known before, Ambition had claimed her completely. He clung to the image of her face in the moments before their relationship had been destroyed by circumstance and choice, using that memory as an anchor for his identity, even as the Genova cells attempted to wash it away. The battle lasted subjective eternities, though the laboratory clocks recorded only hours. When it was over, Vincent remained himself, but transformed beyond recognition. The Genova cells had been integrated into his system, granting him capabilities that no natural human could possess, but his consciousness remained his own. He had become something new, something caught between humanity and monstrosity, but he had not surrendered his essential self to the alien intelligence that dwelt within him. Hojo was ecstatic at the results. His experiment had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, creating a stable human Genova hybrid that retained consciousness while gaining extraordinary capabilities. Vincent could feel the scientist's satisfaction, like a physical presence, could sense Hojo's eagerness to begin the next phase of his research. But the scientist had underestimated one crucial variable in his calculations. The transformation that had enhanced Vincent's physical capabilities had also amplified his psychological state, including his rage at what had been done to him and his determination to prevent similar atrocities. The Genova cells had not made him compliant. They had made him dangerous. The opportunity for revenge came sooner than Vincent had dared hope. Hojo's confidence in his experimental protocols had led him to reduce the security measures surrounding his captive specimen. After all, Vincent was restrained by mechanisms that could hold a creature many times stronger than any human, and his apparent unconsciousness suggested that he posed no immediate threat to the research staff. But Vincent was no longer bound by human limitations. The alien cells that coursed through his system granted him strength that could shatter steel, speed that could blur the line between motion and teleportation. When he finally chose to act, his escape was swift and terrible, a demonstration of power that left the laboratory's security systems in ruins and its personnel fleeing in terror. Vincent's first coherent memory after his transformation was the sensation of standing in the mansion's main hall, surrounded by the wreckage of doors and walls that had been no match for his enhanced strength. His body felt wrong, changed in ways that went beyond the obvious physical modifications. He could sense the Genova cells within him like a second heartbeat, alien and patient, and waiting for him to lose control so they could assert their own agenda. But more disturbing than the physical changes was the realization that months had passed during his captivity and transformation. The seasons had turned while he was imprisoned in Hojo's laboratory, and the world had continued without him. Lucrecia's child had been born, and according to the research logs Vincent had glimpsed during his escape, the infant had survived the experimental treatments and was developing according to Hojo's projections. The thought of that innocent life growing up under Hojo's influence filled Vincent with rage that threatened to overwhelm his tenuous control over the alien cells within him. He could feel something stirring in response to his emotional state, something that was not entirely him, but was nevertheless part of him now. The Genova integration had created more than enhanced capabilities. It had created the potential for transformation into something far more monstrous than his current form. It was this realization that drove Vincent to make the choice that would define the next 30 years of his existence. He could not trust himself to remain in the world while the alien cells coursed through his system, could not risk losing control and becoming the very monster that Hojo had tried to create, and he could not bear to witness the results of the scientist's success, to see Lucrecia's child raised as an experimental subject in service of corporate ambition. In the mansion's basement, In the depths where Hojo had conducted his most secretive research, Vincent found a place that seemed appropriate for his self-imposed exile. A coffin, ornate and somehow fitting for someone who was no longer entirely alive, stood in a chamber that had once served as storage for the mansion's previous owners. It was here that Vincent chose to sleep, to remove himself from a world that could no longer accommodate what he had become. But first, he left behind a record of what had transpired in that place. Using equipment that Hojo had abandoned in his haste to evacuate the facility, Vincent documented the experiments, the transformation, and the consequences of unchecked scientific ambition. He could not undo what had been done to him, could not save Lucrecia's child from the fate that awaited him, but he could ensure that someone, someday, would understand the true cost of the Genova project. The last thing Vincent remembered before surrendering to the unnatural sleep was the weight of the coffin lid closing above him, shutting out the light of a world that had no place for what he had become. He welcomed the darkness, the silence, the suspension of consciousness that would allow him to escape, at least temporarily, from the knowledge of what he had failed to prevent. For 30 years, Vincent Valentine slept the sleep of the damned, his consciousness suspended between waking and nightmare, while the world above him descended into chaos. The child that Hojo had transformed, the being who would come to be known as Sephiroth, grew to become Shinra's greatest weapon, a silver-haired warrior whose strength and skill made him a legend among those who witnessed his exploits. But legends, as Vincent would eventually learn, can become curses when the truth behind them is revealed. Sephiroth's discovery of his origins, his realization that he was not human, but the product of alien cells and scientific hubris, would drive him to madness that threatened all life on the planet. The Genova project that had destroyed Vincent's life and transformed him into a monster would ultimately produce an even greater monster, one whose rage would burn cities and whose ambition would seek to wound the planet itself. Vincent's awakening came not through any natural process, but through the intervention of strangers whose own quest had brought them to the mansion where his story had begun. Cloudstrife and his companions had come seeking answers about Sephiroth's past, following a trail that led inevitably to the place where science had first attempted to play God with alien power. The sound of footsteps in the mansion's halls, the first human voices he had heard in 3 decades, pulled Vincent from his unnatural slumber with a sensation like drowning in reverse. Consciousness returned to him in a rush of sensory input that his enhanced perception processed with overwhelming intensity. He could hear their conversations through layers of stone and wood, could smell their fear and determination, could sense the approach of people whose destinies were somehow entangled with his own. When Cloud and his friends discovered him in the basement chamber, Vincent was no longer the man who had entered that coffin 30 years before. The alien cells had continued their work during his sleep, refining the integration between human and Genova until he existed in a state of perfect biological tension. He was stronger, faster, more resilient than any natural human, but he remained recognizably himself in ways that Hojo's other experiments had not. The first words he spoke upon awakening were directed not at his discoverers, but at the memory of the woman whose choices had led to his transformation. Lucrecia, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. Cloud and his companions, Barrett, Tifa, Aerith, Red the Thien, and the others who had been drawn together by fate and necessity, stared at the crimson-cloaked figure who emerged from his self-imposed tomb like a Gothic revenant. Vincent's appearance was striking and unsettling, tall and pale, with long black hair that framed angular features marked by the subtle signs of his transformation. His eyes, once merely red, now held depths that reflected alien intelligence layered beneath human consciousness. But it was his voice that truly marked him as changed. When Vincent spoke, there was a quality to his words that suggested vast distances and terrible knowledge, the tone of someone who had seen too much and understood too well the prices that progress could demand. He spoke of the past as if it were yesterday, of events 30 years gone as if they had occurred moments before his awakening. "You seek knowledge of the man called Sephiroth," Vincent said, his red eyes studying each member of Cloud's party with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. "I can provide that knowledge, but understand that what you learn will change how you see the world, how you understand the nature of strength and the cost of ambition." And so Vincent Valentine returned to the world, no longer the loyal Turk who had served Shinra without question, no longer the man who had loved Lucrecia Crescent with innocent passion. He had become something new, a guardian of dangerous knowledge, a witness to scientific hubris, a living reminder of what happened when humanity attempted to transcend its limitations through alien power. His presence in Cloud's party was both blessing and curse. Vincent possessed capabilities that made him invaluable in combat against the monsters that Shinra's experiments had unleashed upon the world. His enhanced strength could shatter armor that conventional weapons could barely scratch. His speed allowed him to move through battles like a crimson blur, and his marksmanship, refined by decades of Turk training and enhanced by alien perception, made him deadly at any range. But Vincent also carried within him the seeds of transformation that could manifest when his emotional control faltered. The Genova cells responded to psychological stress by triggering metamorphoses that turned him into creatures of nightmare: Gallian beast, death gigas, hellmasker, chaos. These were not separate entities, but aspects of what the alien integration had made possible, monstrous forms that embodied different facets of Vincent's trauma and guilt. Each transformation was both liberation and imprisonment. In beast form, Vincent could unleash power that dwarfed even his enhanced human capabilities, becoming a force of destruction that could turn the tide of impossible battles. But with that power came the risk of losing himself completely, of surrendering to the alien intelligence that dwelt within the Genova cells and allowing it to subsume his human consciousness. The struggle to maintain his identity while wielding alien power became the defining characteristic of Vincent's existence. Every battle was both an external conflict against Shinra's monsters and an internal war against the temptation to embrace the monstrous capabilities that would make victory easier but humanity more distant. It was a balance that required constant vigilance, a reminder that the price of power was the eternal risk of becoming the very thing one fought against. As Cloud's journey progressed, Vincent found himself confronting not just the external threats that faced the planet, but the internal demons that his transformation had created. The guilt over his failure to protect Lucrecia, the shame of his transformation into something inhuman, the rage at Hojo's violations. All of these emotions threatened to trigger metamorphoses that could endanger his allies as much as his enemies. It was during the party's confrontation with Hojo himself that Vincent's internal struggle reached its most critical point. Face to face with the scientist who had transformed him into a monster, Vincent felt the Genova cells responding to his fury with an eagerness that terrified him. The temptation to unleash his most destructive transformation, to become chaos itself and reduce Hojo to ash and memory, was almost overwhelming. But in that moment of ultimate test, Vincent made a choice that defined his character more completely than any transformation could. He chose restraint over revenge, control over catharsis, humanity over monstrosity. He fought Hojo with skill and strength, But he did not allow himself to become the beast that the scientist's crimes might have justified. "You've changed, Mr. Valentine," Hojo observed during their confrontation, his pale eyes bright with scientific curiosity, even as Vincent's enhanced abilities brought him to the edge of defeat. "The integration appears to have been more successful than I dared hope. You've retained your consciousness while gaining capabilities that transcend human limitations. You're proof that my theories were correct." "I'm proof that your theories were monstrous," Vincent replied, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of self-imposed exile. "You turned people into experiments, love into data, hope into nightmare. Whatever I've become, it's despite your intentions, not because of them." The defeat of Hojo marked a turning point in Vincent's journey toward something that might have been redemption. The scientist's death removed the architect of his transformation from the world, but it could not undo the changes that had been wrought or restore what had been lost. Vincent remained caught between humanity and monstrosity, but he had proven to himself that the choice of which to embrace remained his own. In the final battles against Sephiroth, the silver-haired warrior who represented the ultimate expression of Hojo's ambitions, Vincent found a purpose that transcended his personal trauma. Here was a being who had surrendered completely to alien influence, who had allowed Genova's agenda to subsume his human identity and twist it into something dedicated to planetary destruction. Sephiroth was everything that Vincent could have become if he had chosen differently, a living reminder of the importance of maintaining human consciousness in the face of inhuman power. The battle against Sephiroth was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. On the physical plane, it was a contest between enhanced beings whose capabilities far exceeded normal human parameters. But on a deeper level, it was a struggle between different responses to transformation. Vincent's choice to retain his humanity despite becoming monstrous, and Sephiroth's decision to embrace monstrosity as a path to transcendence. When Sephiroth finally fell, when his ambitions were reduced to cosmic dust and the immediate threat to the planet was ended, Vincent found himself faced with a question that had haunted him throughout his journey. What was the purpose of a monster who had chosen to remain human? The answer came not in grand revelation, but in quiet understanding. Vincent's role was not to be a hero in the traditional sense, but to serve as a guardian of memory, a witness to the consequences of unchecked ambition, a reminder that the choice between humanity and monstrosity was one that every person must make for themselves. He had become living proof that transformation need not mean the loss of self, that power need not corrupt, that even those who had been changed by forces beyond their control could choose how to use what they had been given. In the aftermath of Sephiroth's defeat, as the world began to heal from the wounds inflicted by Shinra's ambitions and alien influence, Vincent chose to continue his wandering. He could not return to the life he had known before his transformation. That man was gone, buried in the coffin where he had slept for 30 years. But he could choose how to live with what he had become. Vincent Valentine became a figure of legend, a crimson-cloaked guardian who appeared when the shadows of the past threatened to consume the present. Those who encountered him spoke of a man whose red eyes held depths of sorrow and wisdom, whose presence brought both comfort and unease, whose very existence served as a reminder that redemption was possible even for those who had been transformed by forces they could not control. He carried within him the weight of memory, Lucrecia's face in the moments before their love was destroyed by ambition, Hojo's cold satisfaction as he documented inhuman experiments, the cry of a newborn child who would grow up to threaten all life on the planet. These memories were his burden and his strength, reminders of what had been lost and what had been saved, of the prices that progress could demand, and the importance of choosing humanity over convenience. Vincent's story became part of the greater legend of Final Fantasy VII, a tale within a tale that spoke to the game's deepest themes. His transformation from loyal soldier to monstrous guardian reflected the larger narrative's exploration of what it means to be human in a world where technology and ambition could reshape the very nature of existence. His choice to retain his humanity despite becoming something inhuman provided a counterpoint to characters like Sephiroth, who allowed power to corrupt them completely. In the end, Vincent Valentine stands as one of Final Fantasy VII's most complex and tragic figures, a man who lost everything he cared about, who was transformed against his will into something monstrous, who spent 30 years in self-imposed exile rather than risk becoming the very evil he had tried to prevent. Yet through it all, he retained the capacity for choice, the ability to decide how to use the power that had been forced upon him. His crimson cloak became a symbol of penance willingly embraced, of guilt transformed into purpose, of monstrosity shaped into guardianship. Vincent chose to carry the weight of the past, not as a burden that would crush him, but as a responsibility that would guide him towards something that might, eventually, be called redemption. The planet remembers all things, and in its memory, Vincent Valentine holds a unique place, not as a hero who saved the world through strength and courage, but as a man who saved himself through choice and will, who proved that even in a universe where alien cells could rewrite human biology, where corporate ambition could transform love into nightmare, where power could corrupt absolutely, the essential nature of humanity could survive and even flourish. Vincent Valentine's tale is one of transformation and choice, of love corrupted and purpose redeemed, of monstrosity embraced and humanity preserved. It speaks to the heart in a world where everything can be changed, where the very nature of existence can be rewritten by those with sufficient power and ruthlessness. What will you choose to remain constant? What will you protect, even at the cost of everything else? For Vincent, the answer was simple and profound. He would remain human, whatever the cost, whatever the pain, whatever the sacrifice required. In choosing humanity over monstrosity, restraint over revenge, purpose over despair, he became not just a character in a legend, but a legend himself. The man in the crimson cloak who proved that redemption was possible, even for those whom the world had given up for lost. His story echoes still in the memory of the planet, a reminder that the choices we make define us more completely than the circumstances we endure, and that even in the darkest nights of the soul, the dawn of redemption remains possible for those who choose to seek it. And so, traveler, the tale draws to its end, for now. The planet still whispers, and many legends remain yet untold. May the memory of what you've heard tonight stay with you on your journey. Before you depart, add your thoughts to the journal. Share what this adventure stirred within you, what paths it reminded you of, or what questions now linger in your mind. In this way, your reflections become part of the story itself. Return when the fire is lit again, and together we shall remember more of what has been. Until then, safe travels, wherever the shadows of memory and the man who walks between humanity and monstrosity may guide you.